Brilliant. Well, thank you everybody for joining me today on this talk on Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And thank you to Sam for having me back as well. Back in, I think it was in October, I also gave a talk for Romancing the Gothic on cozy crime stories, which some of you may remember. And one of the shows that I spoke about was the fantastic TV show Murder, She Wrote. And it doesn't matter if you've never seen it, but it is a wonderful show. It's silly, it's camp, it's light-hearted, it's so much fun. And it's one of my guilty pleasures that I enjoy watching again and again. And you may know that the show likes to play a little bit with formula. It includes a lot of references to popular culture. There have been stories about witches, an obvious reference to the Crucible and the Salem witch trials. There is a story about apparent vampires living in the town, with obvious references to Dracula and Nosferatu. And then there is this episode. Night of the Headless Horseman, a reference to Washington Irving's iconic short story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And yes, quite interestingly with this episode, the first 10-15 minutes or so are almost a direct scene for scene representation of the story. We see the school teacher in a bit of a love triangle. You know, he's in love with somebody. There's a love rival. He's obviously the weakling, the love rival's the much stronger figure. And as the teacher makes his way home, he encounters the Headless Horseman, who chases him, throws his pumpkin head at him, and the teacher trips, falls over, hits his head, and in the case of Murder, She Wrote, is unconscious for part of the beginning. It's really interesting that this popular culture reference makes its way into this murder mystery story. The Headless Horseman even appears in another crime series that I mentioned in my talk as well, Midsummer Murders. And this is a figure called the Night Rider or the Dark Rider. I can never remember exactly what he's called, but essentially it's a headless horseman figure that appears in the village and points at people who are doomed, people who are going to meet a grisly demise. So it soon becomes obvious that the Headless Horseman figure is a popular and well-referenced literary character, and a quick search finds that he is influential to so many films, TV shows, popular cultural references over the decades and even centuries. There is the 1999 Sleepy Hollow film, which we will return to later. There's a 1976 episode of Scooby-Doo, which in turn inspired a 2015 Scooby-Doo Lego set. And you can see the Lego set has a little mini Headless Horseman figure. There was a 1949 Disney feature film called The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. There was a Fox TV series called Sleepy Hollow from 2013 until 2017, which made Sleepy Hollow into a sort of supernatural crime story. They took a lot of that sort of gothic horror elements, the ghost stories, and forged this interesting sort of crime narrative and investigation narrative within the piece. So the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is iconic, a well-referenced story since its publication in 1820. It has captured the imagination of so many people for over the centuries. The story has been retold, reimagined, spoofed, alluded to, paid homage to in so many ways. So strong is its connection that many will know some of the key images and the key scenes without ever having read the story. And I would argue this is quite similar with other stories like Frankenstein or Dracula, where the key elements, characters, scenes, and features have become so popular they have entered the public consciousness, although many people have never actually sat down and read the story. But what I do want to do as part of my talk today is to demonstrate and explain how the short story is filled with so many complexities and historical connections, links to Europe despite being a predominantly American story. The richness of the story is not always apparent in the text itself, but I believe it's just as fascinating to try and unpick and understand why the story in particular has lingered and influenced for over 200 years. So let's look at Washington Irving, the writer himself. Washington Irving was born in New York City in 1783. He was the last of 11 children, and yes, he is named after George Washington. Washington Irving was born the same week that a British ceasefire ended the American Revolution. So his name is a patriotic nod to one of the key revolutionary heroes of the time. And Washington Irving would meet George Washington in 1789 when George Washington visited New York City shortly before his inauguration to become the first president of the United States. And on the left there, you can see a watercolor interpretation of Washington Irving meeting George Washington. But this painting was painted over 50 years after the encounter had happened. But this was a request made by Irving himself, and the painting hung in Irving's own home. Washington Irving's career as a writer was also extremely long. He published a collection of satirical essays aged 19, and his last work, a 5-volume biography on the life of George Washington, was published just a few months before Irving's death. And already we can see the two varying degrees of Irving's writing, one that is satirical and humorous, and the other factual, historical, based on the life of American heroes and American figures. When there was an outbreak of yellow fever in Manhattan in 1798, Irving and a friend headed north of the city to safety, spending time in the town known as Tarrytown, the place that Irving would call in his story Sleepy Hollow, and where in 1996 the area known as North Tarrytown formally changed its name to Sleepy Hollow as part of a very shrewd marketing ploy. In 1809, Irving wrote a history of New York from the beginning of the world to the end of the Dutch dynasty. The book itself is largely a parody, a satire of early New York history, particularly satirizing Samuel Latham Mitchell's own history of New York, which had been published a year earlier. Irving's book was originally published under the pseudonym of Dietrich Knickerbocker, a fantastic name, and Knickerbocker is presented as a Dutch historian. Now, Irving created Dietrich Knickerbocker as part of a hoax. Before the publication of the book, Irving published a number of articles in the local papers about Knickerbocker, claiming that Knickerbocker had gone missing from his hotel room in New York City. This missing persons case captured the public's imagination. Officials were concerned for his welfare. There was even a reward offered for the safe return of Dietrich Knickerbocker. It was a shrewd piece of marketing. Eventually, it was decided, as the advertisement in the local newspapers claimed, that the book by Knickerbocker had to be published in order to pay off his hotel debts. And so when the book was published, there was a huge amount of interest. And it's noted that Irving wrote for pleasure in order to produce pleasure for the reader, where we see good history and biography presented as literary entertainment. And we certainly see that with Dietrich Knickerbocker, this idea of having great fun with a made-up historical character, but also using it as a method to entertain and to educate people. And this continues to be an ongoing theme of Irving's work. The one hand, the seriousness and the truth to what he's writing, but also on the other hand, a mocking, satire, fictionalization and sensationalizing of stories in order to entertain, to give pleasure. Irving suffered his own hardship, however. He was sent to Europe for 2 years in 1804 after he started to suffer from tuberculosis. And in 1809, the same year that the history of New York was published, his fiancée died suddenly from consumption, with Irving remaining unmarried for the rest of his life. He would go on to be made a colonel of the New York State Militia, and in 1815 he left for Europe, where he remained for 17 years. He returned to writing and became good friends with figures such as Sir Walter Scott, who encouraged his writing and directed him towards the useful tools of German folk tales, which we'll come on to a little bit in a moment. In 1819, Irving began to serialize a collection of essays and short stories in a collection called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gent. It's a slightly odd title, but let me explain. Geoffrey Crayon is the narrator of this piece, another figure like Dietrich Knickerbocker. And in this story, Geoffrey Crayon is traveling to Britain and then across Britain, and he's documenting what he sees, who he encounters, and the stories he is told. Crayon documents his voyage from the United States, his experiences in the English countryside, his attempts to find London locations from Shakespeare plays. He writes of a tour of Westminster Abbey and discusses the library there. He talks of funeral traditions. He spends a traditional Christmas with an English family. It really is a wide and varied collection of essays and stories. At times, it's humorous, and at other points, it's contemplative and reflective. Remember that this was actually written predominantly for an American market, although it would prove very popular for British readers as well. In fact, at the time, Francis Jeffreys in the Edinburgh Review wrote that it was written throughout with the greatest care and accuracy and worked up to great purity and beauty of diction on the model of the most elegant and polished of our native writers. Jeffreys here is noting the distinction of a book by an American achieving great success with British readers, so much so that Jeffreys' own belief is that the collection is so strong and so readable because it reads like an English novel, an English story, English tales. So there's this constant contrast between Washington Irving, the American, and Washington Irving with the European and sometimes British influences. The sketchbook is then part travel guide, part history book, part book of English customs, and part recounting of unusual stories, of which Sleepy Hollow is one of them, appearing in the 6th installment. It's interesting that a book primarily about travels in Britain would include 2 iconic short stories that were actually set in New York State, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow being one of them, and Rip Van Winkle being the other. When Irving finally returned and settled in the United States, many were concerned as to whether he had gone full European, something he attempted to dispute with his heavy work as a biographer of American greats, such as George Washington. Nonetheless, Washington Irving did write this. He says, Europe held forth all the charms of storied and poetic association. There were to be seen the masterpieces of art, the refinements of high cultivated society, the quaint peculiarities of ancient and local customs. My native country was full of youthful promises. Europe was rich in the accumulated treasures of age. And this is perhaps the interesting point of Irving's period. Even though the United States was finding its own voice and its own identity with people such as Irving as a writer contributing, it was also a nation that was still heavily indebted and influenced by Europeans who had settled there. The British, the Dutch, the French, the German, all would leave lasting legacies. William Kane writes this: politically, the colonies had made their break from Great Britain, but the literature American readers knew was English literature. And that's the interesting part of the story. Dietrich Knickerbocker, as we've already seen, is regarded as a Dutch historian, whilst Dutch families remain a prominent feature within the story of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow itself. There is this constant fusion of cultures and attitudes and identity that we will see constantly appear. And even in the story, Irving finds this notion of ghosts and European settlers to be really prominent. He writes, besides, there is no encouragement for ghosts in most of our villages, for they have scarcely had time to finish their first nap, and turn themselves in their graves before their surviving friends had travelled away from the neighbourhood, so that when they turn out at night to walk their rounds, they have no acquaintances left to call upon. This is perhaps the reason why we so seldom hear of ghosts, except in our long established Dutch communities. So this is quite interesting that in this instance, and this is from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, this idea that Irving is relating the prominence of ghost stories to the fact that these are European influence communities. These are not just Dutch communities, but particularly American Dutch communities that bring with them the legacies, the stories, the folklores, the mythologies that have been passed down from generation to generation, even from across the continent. And believe that this is part of the reason why this identity and these stories are so strong. So that is some of the background to Irving and the period, which I hope gives us a bit of insight into the story itself. Going to the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the story claims to have been discovered among the papers of Dietrich Knickerbocker, again a return to Irving using a favourite Dutch creation. The story is set in 1790, not long after the American Revolutionary War, and Sleepy Hollow, or Tarrytown, as it was known then, are former Dutch settlements in New York State. And you can see on this map, this is the modern day map here, but you can see that the area is north of New York City, but still on the Hudson River, which you can just see on the left-hand side. And like many towns and villages from the period, it has an old world charm. Wooden built buildings, wooden covered bridges, that sort of foliage that looks really stunning in the autumn, as you can see, this very sort of typical New England vibe. And it's interesting in a way that this is the backdrop that has become so closely associated with the American ghost story. If we think in similar terms to the Salem witch trials, or even more recently, stories such as the Amityville horror. You only have to type in New England ghost on a search engine to be met with pages and pages of results on ghost sightings and the topmost haunted bridge and the topmost haunted hotel and the topmost haunted house. It's a constant vibe of ghosts and ghouls and other intrigue within this area. And it is, of course, an area that Irving himself knew well. As we mentioned in the 1790s, he lived there for a time following an outbreak of yellow fever in New York City. And eventually, when he settled back in America, this is where he spent the rest of his life. And rather fittingly, he is buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. And the setting of the story, the background of Sleepy Hollow, is such an integral part to this story. It's described in great detail at the beginning, keeping that Knickerbocker historian guise. We're told about the Dutch settlement origins. We're told about the impact of the American Revolutionary Wars. We're told that there was a well-known traitor to the independent cause who was caught within the area. These beautiful, romantic, but very historical scenes that are played out. And we're also told this. We're told that some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others, an old Indian chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there. Certain it is the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air. So from the outset, we're given that Sleepy Hollow is a kind of magical environment, something that really encaptures, mystifies, bewitches people. And there's an interesting kind of sense of people trying to pin down exactly what is the cause. It's suggested it might be a high German doctor, it might be Native Americans, it might be something else entirely, but no one can deny that there is some strange allure, there's something really captivating that causes people to have visions or hallucinations. And again, this feeds into the mythology, the stories that are constantly being shared by this community, so, which kind of makes this sensation worse in a way. People start sharing ghost stories, and then suddenly people start to see these ghosts manifesting because these stories are being told. This constant retelling of traditional folklore and oral traditions. Returning to the main bulk of the story itself, we are presented with Ichabod Crane. He is a school teacher from Connecticut, and he's given lodgings within the town. And he moves from sort of house to house each week as part of his sort of stipend. He's not paid enough to have his own house, so he has to sort of lodge with the local residents. But notably, he is an outsider. And again, we see a blending of fact and fiction, because on the left here, you can see a photograph from 1848 of Colonel Ichabod Crane. Now, Irving himself does not outrightly admit where the name came from, but it's quite interesting that we find that there was somebody else living in the New York, New Jersey area with a very distinctive name of Ichabod Crane. In fact, Peter Malia has noted that Irving probably did meet Colonel Ichabod Crane about 6 years before The Legend of Sleepy Hollow was published. So there certainly could be some kind of connection there. And there are also several schoolmasters who lived in Sleepy Hollow or within the surrounding area who have claimed that the character, apart from the name, is based on them. This includes people like Jesse Merwin and Samuel Youngs, although this is harder to prove with any certainty whether Irving did base the story on them. And on the right, you can see an 1890s illustration of Crane from the story. And this was drawn by Edward Austin Abbey. And Ichabod Crane is presented as a strange, unusual character, not least because, as I say, he is the outsider within the story. He is described as tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served for shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at the top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, a long snipe nose that looked like a cock perched upon its spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew. So a really distinctive looking character. And I think there's a really interesting point that Irving's making here, because he's very tall, he's very skinny, his clothes almost seem a bit ill-fitting in a way. And this contrasts with some of the other figures that we see within the story, these American Dutch residents of Sleepy Hollow, who are much broader, broad shoulders, broad arms, butch and masculine looking, very athletic and fit. And we have this constant juxtaposition of Ichabod Crane, the sort of weakling outsider, the anti-hero of the story, and his much more masculine, dominant figures that exist within the town itself. Ichabod Crane believes also that he has an excellent singing voice. He sings very loudly in the church choir. He views himself as an intellectual. He has a large appetite for food and an interest for the finer things in life. In many ways, he also regards himself as intellectually superior to his neighbours, although it is noted that his favourite book is Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft. And for those of you who don't know, Cotton Mather was a writer, historian, and also a priest. And he was involved within the Salem witch trials. And Mather lost a lot of his credibility because he tried to justify the events and his involvement with the Salem witch trials. And many people were quite concerned about the sort of bloodthirst that individuals like Mather had in this instance for the killing of many innocent people. And Ichabod Crane's obsession and fascination with Mather's witches contradicts this attempt to present Crane as an intellectual. Now, I don't mean to suggest that you can't be an intellectual and be fascinated by witches and witchcraft. That can happen. But within the context of the story, this is presented as a paradox. He can't be an intellectual, but be interested in this sort of folklore, mythology, lowbrow kind of element. That's constantly being presented as this constant contradictions that appear throughout the narrative. Crane is the outsider, but he makes great attempts to fit in. But vanity and ignorance become his barrier. He is drawn to Katrina van Tassel, the daughter of a wealthy farmer who is descended, of course, from Dutch heritage. Not only because he finds her beautiful, but also because he realizes, quite calculating, that she is an only child, and therefore she will be the sole inheritor of the estate. But there is competition for Katrina by Abraham van Brunt. But because Ichabod is that sort of weakling intellectual, he won't fight for the honor of Katrina. And Van Brunt decides that the only thing he can do is to harass and frighten Crane. At a harvest festival, Ichabod is told a number of ghost stories by the partygoers. And it says that just sufficient time had elapsed to enable each storyteller to dress up his tale with a little bit becoming fiction, and in the indistinctiveness of his recollection, to make himself the hero of every exploit. And what's happening here is essentially the stories are being told again and again and again, and fact and fiction's being blended. People are inserting themselves into this story. They're reimagining what really happened, putting themselves as the hero. These are not just ghost stories, but personal encounters and personal victories. And this includes Abraham van Brunt, who claims that he too has raced against the headless horseman, the ghost of a German soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball in the American Revolutionary War and is supposedly buried in Sleepy Hollow churchyard. And you can see here, this is, if you go to Sleepy Hollow churchyard today, this sign, as a much more recent sign, appears that tries to sort of entice you to say how important the churchyard is within the narrative, although the horse doesn't necessarily mention the graveyard as its kind of main stomping ground. But later, spurned by Katrina, Crane returns home on horseback and becomes convinced that he sees ghosts all around him, that all the stories of ghosts and goblins that he heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had laid. So again, we see this immersion in a landscape, and because of these tales that have been told, suddenly this is everywhere. He's recognizing the tree, the churchyard, the covered bridge, all of these features, this local mythology that people have been telling within their ghost stories. He's now a part of it. He's now immersed in that landscape, and everywhere he looks, he sees these ghosts. He understands the connection, the places, the people. And it's here that eventually he encounters the headless horseman. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen, black, and towering, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveller. He appeared to be a large horseman of large dimensions and mounted on a black horse, a powerful frame. Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless, but his horror was still more increased on observing that the head, which should have rested on the shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of the saddle. His terror rose to desperation. And it was a really interesting encounter, this sort of sense of this huge looming figure. The horse is huge, the headless horseman's huge. The emphasis on the head not being there, but resting sort of on the lap of this sort of creature. And the sense that this is the horror, the ghost story coming to life. Ichabod is chased and he falls from his horse in the commotion. And the next day, his hat is found by the bridge, a broken pumpkin nearby, and he is reported missing. And you're sort of left to draw your own conclusion as to what really happened. But curiously, was his disappearance supernatural or otherwise? But regardless, it becomes part of the local folklore. Crane is forever immortalized in the ongoing retelling of the area's ghost story. He himself has become the character of the story. Now, in the story, we're told that the Headless Horseman is a Hessian soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball. Hessian soldiers were German soldiers fighting in the American Revolutionary War on the side of the British. So once again, we have the return of spectres, ghosts, but certainly spectres from the past. And in this instance, someone who was on the enemy's side, killed in battle in grisly circumstances, and seemingly haunting the area that he once knew. Some tales even claiming that he is looking for the head that's gone missing. It's morbid, but vaguely plausible. Franz Potter writes that the Headless Horseman represents a past that never truly dies. And this is what Potter says. The Headless Horseman supposedly seeks revenge and a head, which he thinks was unfairly taken from him. This injustice demands that he continually search for a substitute. The horseman, like the past, still seeks answers, still seeks retribution, and can't rest. We are haunted by the past, which stalks us, that we never forget it. And I think in many ways, this is part of the intrigue of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The reason why it's constantly been reimagined in all of these adaptations and all of these stories and retellings, and why it's entered the public consciousness, it is about history. It is about identity and this crisis and this desire to strike the balance between justice and injustice, good and evil, between wicked and real life fact and fiction. It's this beautiful melding of all of these ideas that seem really, really plausible and really notable, that seems universal. And that's perhaps the reason why so many people are inspired by it. And despite this legend of Sleepy Hollow being such a local occurrence, we soon find that the Headless Horseman are common tales, primarily in European tales from the Middle Ages. In the centre here, you can see the Dalahan in Irish folklore, which talks of a headless rider and sometimes a headless horse as well. And often the Dalahan is depicted carrying his own head. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the Green Knight's head is chopped off, but he picks it up and he rides away with it. There are stories from Scotland, from Wales, from Germany, all places that Washington Irving knew and had visited multiple times. Even Irving's friend, the poet Sir Walter Scott, had written translations of some of these German tales, such as the poem The Chase and the Wild Huntsman from 1796. And even in Christianity, which you can see on the left-hand side there, although these are not on horseback, there are several occurrences of beheaded saints carrying their heads, a symbol of divine power. And this is the interesting thing. If you start to sort of look at these headless individuals and headless horsemen throughout history, sometimes they are omens of good. This idea that they're stalking the earth to pay retribution, this sort of penance, to do good, to help people. So there's a constant, again, battle of good and evil, depending on what the story is. Sometimes they're good and saintly, and sometimes they're devilish and evil. And particularly the Legend of Sleepy Hollow goes down that evil route. And this is the appeal, in many ways, of Sleepy Hollow. The fact that it's grounded in old tale, old historic mystery and horror. We mentioned already how many of the settlements in New England were from primarily European countries. And although a new future is being forged, the tales and intrigue of the past, the historical and cultural baggage are brought with them in many ways. This strange and unusual world in America being filled with that cultural mystery, intrigue, and questions of identity. And this is why The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is regarded as a classic, the originator of the American short story, because it claims an identity, a mythology for its own, one that's reimagined specifically for this landscape and for its people. The Headless Horseman tale is a story that is at once frightening, warning, a connection with the past. It's a joke, it's scaremongering, it's filled with the anxieties and fears of the people projected onto it. the lack of any definite conclusion and closure to the story, its constant contradictions are part of that appeal that demands our interpretation and attention as the reader. And this is what brings me on to the film, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is perhaps one of the most recognizable adaptations of the story. And if you've seen the film or not read the book or vice versa, then you'll probably realize that there's a constant reimagining of the story, that people are not always faithful to the original. And the film is no different here. It changes huge amounts of the plot and characters to the point that it only bears a faint resemblance to the story. But I'm going to get you to watch this trailer, and you can draw some of your own conclusions. The film obviously plays on the gothic and darker elements of the story. There is an emphasis here on Crane as the outsider, as we know, but the film redresses this as a sort of murder mystery narrative. Crane is a detective rather than a schoolmaster who is trying to prove that his newfangled forensic methods work as effective policing. And you can probably tell that I'm not entirely keen on the film because it strips away some of the fun and the confusion of the story. It becomes centered on finding fact and proof. I do also find it quite frustrating that this sort of love rivalry that happens between Ichabod Crane and Andrew Van Brunt is very abruptly cut short within the film, because Andrew Van Brunt, spoiler alert, is killed by the Headless Horseman in the film. Doesn't happen within the story. And this is perhaps one of the stranger details of it. The uncertainty of the original Washington Irving story is part of its appeal. The ignorance and arrogance of Ichabod Crane within the short story makes him an anti-hero. He's not a fresh-faced attempt at a heartthrob that we see within this narrative of the film. But Irving's own story does have a lot of fun with it. And I'll let you draw your own conclusion as to which you prefer. But this is part, as we've been mentioning, this complexity of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, its desire to claim European influences as its own, and what's been happening over the last 200 years with all these other adaptations, reinterpretations, reimaginings, again, have been taking the story and finding elements that really speak to people, why that legacy is so important. And this is arguably part of the charm and the appeal of Sleepy Hollow. It's a story filled with contradictions, with confusions. It's filled with tall tales, fact versus fiction, practical jokes, and hardship of a love rivalry. What I hope to have performed in this talk is the unpicking of some of the influences and elements of the story, how these provide a richness and authenticity to that story and enhance our enjoyment from it. Indeed, the story's playing around with the truth is one of its most curious factors. Can we trust what we've read? And is there any truth in it at all? The mark, I think, of any good horror or ghost story is that slight glimmer of truth, that slight sense of authenticity to which the writer and the reader or the viewer can attach our own meanings, our own fears, our own apprehensions. And sometimes it doesn't matter if it is the whole truth, as we see within these adaptations and reinterpretations. It just needs to be enough and just convincing enough. And it's that appeal and that charm that we see with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a ghost story that transcends the ages because of that connection with a truth, regardless of what that is. Thank you.